Matt coming? There's a car seat out there too.
So,
Oh, and there's hot dogs in there for Frank. Maybe we should just give it to him.
all right. Well, we are back in the Psalms, and this evening we'll be in Psalm 100. So last week we were in Psalm 99, and this week I decided just to go ahead and carry it over to Psalm 100, a psalm that I think will be encouraging and helpful. So we'll go ahead and read it together, and then we will work through it in a way that I hope will be helpful by way of just exposure, highlighting some things, pressing us to application. So the psalm begins, a psalm for thanksgiving. Shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Actually, I have it corrected in there, don't I? Yeah. So when I switch from NASB to LSB, I sometimes overstep. And so let me try that again. Psalm for thanksgiving. Shout joyfully to Yahweh, all the earth. Serve Yahweh with gladness. Come before him with joyful singing. Know that Yahweh himself is God. It is he who made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name, for Yahweh is good. His loving kindness is everlasting, and his faithfulness to all generations. So Psalm 100, I discovered, is one of the most popular and well-known psalms. Is that one that I think of Psalm 23, obviously, Psalm 1, Psalm 2, Psalm 110, Psalm 119, but Psalm 150, but apparently Psalm 100 is a very popular psalm within certain circles in particular because of its relationship to many historic hymns and songs, particularly in the more liturgical tradition. So if Church of England or Anglican Church, some Presbyterian, some Methodist, it actually is a well-known psalm because of its point of contact with a lot of old hymns that specifically draw from it or make reference to it. So just curious if that was anybody else's experience. So that was one for you. Okay, good. So,
Allie and I sing it. There's a pastor. I don't listen to him, but he does psalms.
oh, like sings them?
Like he sings psalms and does his own arrangement. He's Presbyterian.
Yeah,
and he sang this one specifically.
Oh,
and
good.
That's how we know it.
Good. Yeah, there is. It's not uncommon, especially with Presbyterian churches, and some in particular will only sing out of the Psalms. They've adapted music to it, to the Psalter, and it's a good practice anyway. I enjoy the Psalms that are meant to be sung. There is a bit of a bridge that we have to make because we're not singing them in Hebrew. We're going to miss some of the poetic flow of it, obviously. And so there's some amendments that sometimes are made that are reasonable, but they saturate our songs and saturate our hymns. And that's the case with Psalm 100 in particular. So you might recognize one of the older songs. One of them, I did recognize an older one and a newer one. So I've exposed you to one of the newer ones, which you got exposed to the chorus at least. Both are rooted in this psalm. So the first one is all people that on earth do dwell. Does anybody remember that? It's an old one. It's from 1561. So it's been around a long time. And again, I think once you start hearing it, you would catch on to it pretty quickly. Oh, the reason that the words didn't match the song we just sang is because I picked the wrong song. It was He Has Made Me Glad. So from 1976, so not quite obviously as old, not over 450 years old or 460 years old, but much more contemporary by that way. And a simple song. And song we sang was very simple as well. And there's nothing inherently wrong with simple songs because one of their advantages, a hymn, truth-rich, develops a story or a narrative a lot of times from 1, 2, 3, and 4. I don't know how many of y'all experienced like music leaders back when we sang out of hymnals more consistently. It was line 1 and 3 or line 1, 2, and 4. And it's like there's a lot of times there's a build to it, and there's a lot of times there's an intentionality to it. And so it's understandable. They obviously they do have a skill set to recognize how to parse things, but there is something to be said for that. But also simple songs because they stay with you. I mean, it's you'll maybe remember the chorus that we sang this evening when I picked the wrong song. But you'll remember this is the day the Lord has made, and we too rejoice and be glad. That's real easy for that to remain in your mind. But He Has Made Me Glad is one that's specifically rooted in Psalm 100. If we like to look at that later, and there's many others too. But any ideas as to why, of all the Psalms, Psalm 100 has been one that has been drawn from a good bit, and maybe more so than others, maybe not, but certainly has had a lot of attention in terms of songs and hymns and like material. Any thoughts or ideas just on what we read and even just looking at it here up on the screen before you? I'll give you a hint. It's always a good place to start when we're looking at the Psalms. Yeah, look at the header on it. So the header of the Psalm gives us some very clear direction, I would say. We don't have the authorship, we don't have the historical context, but we have a clear identification of the Psalm. It's one of thanksgiving. And so that makes very natural bridge to singing and to giving thanks to God. And even the words of the Psalm throughout, they lend themselves to, we've got to do something. Well, let's sing this thing. And it's the only psalm to actually bear that header or that title, a psalm of thanksgiving. So of all the psalms in the Psalter, it's the only one. Many of them obviously have profound expressions of thanksgiving. You could probably just, from memory, if not citing the psalm itself, but just draw from many psalms, many areas that have referenced thanksgiving, expressing thanksgiving in a variety of ways. But it's the only psalm that's actually titled a psalm of thanksgiving. And again, so it stands out in that regard, and it's natural to draw from it accordingly. So the header, it's an important contribution to our understanding why this psalm has uniquely impacted many in their worship to God, specifically through singing. But we can also plainly observe that this is an action-packed psalm too, isn't it? And by action-packed, it's not one of maybe the Davidic psalms where he's running or maybe praying that the Lord would deal with his enemies. It's a different kind of action-packed psalm. It has 7 imperatives. So we have 7 imperatives peppered throughout the psalm, driving us to worship. So let's look at those. We have shout joyfully, serve Yahweh, and serve can also be exchanged with worship. Any ideas as to why serve and worship might fit together? I don't go think of like somebody serving a table and be like they're worshiping at the table, but how might that be used interchangeably, serve and worship? That can help with a prohibition. Over and over again, Israel's told not to serve idols.
Well, out of a worshipful heart, you do serve.
Yeah, if
It
it's
shows love for the Lord.
yeah, if it's a
Mindful
context.
He made us. We didn't do it ourselves. Just the whole thing is a high view of God.
Yeah, and if you are serving deity, or if you're serving a God or the one true God, it's an expression of worship, isn't it? So we have serving in a variety of contexts, and maybe that's something to think about as well in the context of sometimes we struggle with the identity of how can we be found faithful, what can we do for the church, or what can we do in terms of just our Christian walk in terms of exercising our gifts. Well, being faithful is an expression of service, which in turn is an expression of worship. So serve Yahweh. Be faithful in worshiping and being faithful in your just common work and the work that you've been entrusted. Come before him. Know Yahweh. Enter his gates. Give thanks. Bless his name. So again, a peppering of imperatives here. So it's an action-packed psalm. And beyond the header, we can clearly see this enthusiastic and clear call to worship that saturates the psalm, doesn't it? It kind of forces you to do something. It's one of those with, what do I do with it? I know I should do something with it. And so singing is a pretty natural reaction or working out of it. But we also need to remember this is a high view. So we're going to get to application just a little bit. But before we go too far down the road in terms of singing and other expressions of application, let me draw out some observations. So 5 verses, we can give a number of observations in a packed amount of time. So let's give a high level to our psalm this evening, and then again consider some more application beyond singing as well. So we'll begin by engaging the traditional, maybe super simplistic, but I think still helpful, the who, what, where, high, and wow questions. Those are easy enough, right? We can approach a text and ask those things. That's sometimes very helpful, especially in this kind of question or this kind of context. So the who of Psalm 100. Well, verse 1, all the earth, right? And what does that fail to encompass? It's everything, right? So all the earth is the who of verse 1. So this is all the earth's been called to do something, called to shout to Yahweh. Then we have Yahweh. is a major who, right? Verses 1 through 5. How many verses are in Psalm 100? 5. And so Yahweh encompasses all of them in terms of he is the primary who, as it were. And then the other who that is involved would be Israel, I'd say implicitly initially, and then explicitly later. So implicitly 1 and 2, explicitly 3 through 5. Now, I've already kind of tipped my hand because I jumped ahead of myself, but who of the who's is the primary who?
No.
This is not Dr. Seuss teaching, just asking of the who's that we're observing in Psalm 100, who's the primary who? Yahweh is. So we see that very, very plainly here. And such is always the case when addressing biblical worship, right? It's an easy way to evaluate our worship. Who's the primary who in our worship? If it's not the Lord, then it's something less. It's an expression of idolatry or failure. You take your pick there because it's not biblical worship. So Yahweh, the Lord, is the source and object of all true worship. So it's of no surprise that Yahweh is the dominant element of this psalm of thanksgiving, the psalm of worship, the song of pressing us to action-packed response, has a constant view to the Lord. So Yahweh is the primary who, but there are two others identified. The first began with all the earth, and who has the authority to call the entirety of all the earth to worship?
Yahweh.
Yeah, this is, and why? Why? Is it just because, he got his name saturated in the Psalms, so he gets to call the shots? Or why does Yahweh get to call the entirety of the earth to worship?
He created it.
Yeah, so we have the sovereign creator. So it's not that he beat out some other deity, or that, it's a regional matter, which, again, this is part of paganism. Whose God is the dominant one? Whose God won out this time? Now, this is the creator of all the heavens and the earth, and he's calling the earth to shout to Yahweh, to worship, to cry out to him in worship. So the sovereign creator. And what is, I'm jumping my head of myself. I need to pace myself. So what is the sovereign of all the earth calling it to do? Yeah, shout joyfully to Yahweh, praise Yahweh. So the third who is Israel. So we have Yahweh, the primary who. We have all the earth, and now we have Israel. So Israel is implicitly present throughout and explicitly present in verses 3 through 5. And we conclude this based off of the simple fact that whose psalter was this? Whose song book, whose worship and prayer book was this? Israel, the Hebrews, Jews. I only got a little ways into it. Sometimes, especially on Wednesday when I'm trying to button up my work on the psalm, I'll see if various teachers have spoke on it. It's helpful. Sometimes it rounds out things. And I was listening to Alistair Begg this morning. And is anybody familiar with Alistair Begg? So Scottish pastor in Ohio, because, that makes sense. But he was speaking of growing up with the Common Book of Prayer, and that Psalm 100, he was one of the ones that in the liturgical context, from his background, he's Baptist now, thoroughly Baptist, but with his background, that was something he was familiar with. And so I'd say, the Common Book of Prayer, that would be the Anglican Church, or I guess over in Scotland as well. But for Psalm 100 in its plainest expression, it's the Israelites, that's the Hebrew scriptures. And so it makes sense that we would be saying, they're the first point of connection, contextually, historically, and otherwise. So it's implicitly, they're going to be present if there's a call and command to worship, because it's in the Psalms. But we also conclude based off of the first and simple fact that not only is it their scriptures, but let's see how this develops as well.
Well, when it says all the earth, though, is that more than Israel?
Yeah, and I would say, but they're witness-bearing nations to declare that Yahweh's excellencies to all peoples, and so it fits with their mission, and it fits with the call that all the earth is to worship. And we've looked at a few other psalms with expanding beyond Israel, but it's
proclaim his name, his renown.
Yes, because obviously it's to go beyond. But first point of contact, it would be like in this context, I'm teaching to the church. But what do? You go out and you do the witness-bearing work of the church. So beginning with verses 3 to 5, we have a more explicit connection to Israel. Yahweh has made them. And while this is true in the broader sense of Yahweh as creator, and that's where I was initially landing, I was seeing a call to the earth and the creator God, but we have to look at the context in which immediately, and we're the sheep of his pasture. Well, does Yahweh not create all people? Yes, absolutely, but there is a special sense in which he did create, set apart, make this people for himself. And this appears to be the nature of the language here, the more direct reference to Yahweh making them a people, making them his covenant people. And we know that this creation language is so used for Israel in a handful of places. And I selected Deuteronomy 32. I think it's probably one of the more plain ones. Now, it is in a context. If you look it up, you're like, wait, that's a context of correction. But it doesn't mean it's not true, right? And there's other places that occasionally I'll make general reference, but we're looking at the principles drawn out. So Israel, Yahweh made you and established you. So we see that same creating language, but it was, in a sense, a special. He drew you out. He made a nation from within a nation. He made you a special people. So he's made this nation, this covenant nation. And then moreover, in clear language, is that's more commonly applied to Israel, his people, right? That's what we would expect to see, the sheep of his pasture. Remember, we're working through John 10. It was weeks, months ago now that we were in 1 Peter chapter 5 with the command, the call to shepherd the flock of God among you, the charge to the elders. And we kind of spent a little bit of time looking at Ezekiel and the rebuke and to the shepherds of Israel. They failed to shepherd, and then there's going to be a good chief shepherd that rises up, and talked about David, God's shepherd for Israel. And so this is plain language that we would expect to see for Israel, right? Now, is it language that we can appreciate? Yeah, absolutely. Let me back up for just a second before I have the tabernacle up there. And one of the things is that when we get to a point of application, we want to be careful, and Pastor Frank is good at drawing us on this in terms of we have to recognize first in historical context, and then recognize, boy, we've been grafted into these blessings, and we can rejoice in that. But again, the most immediate context is Israel, you've been created. You're his people, the sheep of his pasture. But now, as part of Christ's church, recognizing that we're distinct from Israel, can we also take great joy in that, though? Has he not created a people? Has he not called us his own? Are we not the sheep of his pasture? In the sense that, again, the good shepherd has called us out. That's what we're rejoicing in and memorizing together. Now, in terms of another clear, overt point of context for Israel, enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. This is the line I kept looking for in the wrong song, because that is in the proper song. And we're singing, or people do sing, enter his gates with thanksgiving in your hearts and his courts with praise. Well, who would that most naturally fit with? The context of Israel, right? So this is the language of coming to worship at the tabernacle. And so we see that this is a call to worship. Because again, you remember what the woman at the well, she's talking to Jesus. Well, we know that you worship where? The temple, right? In Jerusalem. We worship over here. And so there's a recognition that in terms of the structured worship, the sacrificial system and the prescribed elements, that had a place and a location, the tabernacle and later the temple. And he's picking up on that language. And so we have the enter the gates. And so you have on here, the bottom left there, the courtyard's set aside and kind of blocked off initially with the material there to set it apart. So you enter there, and what are you doing when you enter there? You're going to worship, right? I know that not everybody comes here every day and works here, but probably when you come here, you're not thinking, come and hang out or coming to watch the game. And we do enjoy a variety of fellowship and a time together, but your primary objective when you come in is, now I'm setting time aside to pray, to fellowship, to worship, to give attention to the scriptures. There's an intentionality to it. That's the kind of language he's drawing from, a certain overt intentionality. So coming to the tabernacle to worship, coming to his courts with praise. Again, this is the language of worship, language that carried over to the temple worship, and I think language that we can consider for ourselves and give thanks to God for. And even the closing verse expresses itself with covenant language, Yahweh's loving kindness. This is his hesed, his steadfast, his covenant love. Well, again, first point of application would be to Israel, but returning thanks to God for his loving kindness. So that's the who. That was a lot of time on the who. We're not going to spend as much time on the others, but engaging who, I would say, is always really important, right? And you need context. You need who, the point of application, the point of command, the point of correction. It has to land somewhere, right? And so the who is very important. And the primary who is Yahweh. And so we need to make sure this is a context of worship. So Yahweh is the source and object of worship. So that who is imperative. The whole earth will participate. So that's an important who. That's fascinating. Well, how's that going to look and how's it going to work itself out? Well, we know that. We look forward to, obviously, the missional work of the church now, but ultimately we're looking forward to the Revelation 20 here, the Messianic kingdom, the millennial kingdom of Christ, when the whole earth will worship as they ought to, and specifically in a light context. And then there's the clear and special distinct application to Israel, a people set apart as worshipers. That was the identity of their nation. They were worshiping people who declare and call others to worship as well. They were never to be a singular people in terms of, they're the good ones, and well, let's just isolate those good ones. Well, there was a measure of isolation and protection for the integrity of the worship and of obedience and of faithfulness, but they were to declare Yahweh's excellencies. When they were in their prime, they did that. They just didn't stay in their prime very long. So, are concluding that we, Christ Church, are we saying that we don't have a point of application because we don't have a who in here? No, yeah, because first of all, we can at least, at the minimal, we're part of the earth, right? So we can at least shout to Yahweh. So we fit there, but we're also, as we've already talked about, we are part of the redeemed, participating and heeding in this range of commands to worship. So we don't read, as we've talked about with our hermeneutical approach and understanding the scriptures, we don't read from the end backwards, but we also don't say, well, that backwards, it doesn't really apply or fit to us. It does. This is a call for the church also to join in worship. We learn and we grow and we see. No, we're not going to go to the tabernacle, but we can say, what is being expressed there? How do we who worship in spirit worship in a like fashion? So the who. And I want to pause our observations now after who to maybe clarify some structure elements that I think who informs, and as we continue to go forward, I think it would be helpful. So most agree that the structure of Psalm 100 is a two-part structure. So 1 to 3, 4 to 5. That's pretty common. Now some put verse 3 by itself. So 1, 2, section 3, or verse 3, and then 4 and 5. I'm persuaded that the two-part split reflects the text. And William Ben Gimron, you'll hear me reference him every so often. I think he's a very valuable resource. If you are just looking for a general resource, I'm very pleased and encouraged with him as I've worked through the Psalms for a long time. And I think he's expressed the straightforward simplicity of the Psalm with how it's broken up here. So it's an A-B, a call to give thanks, and then celebration of the covenant. So that's one unit. Second unit, call to give thanks, celebration of the covenant. Wait a second, is he just being redundant? No, it's part 1, part 2. It is two separate things expressing effectively the same thing. And with this, note that verses 1, 2, and 4, they constitute the call to give thanks, right? And these are the actions of worship. So that's 1 and 2 and 4, which they kind of mirror each other in our pairing. And verses 3 and 5 constitute the reasons for these calls to give thanks and to worship. So again, 3 and 5 give us our reasons, the why we're doing that. Now let's consider the what observations. So we have who, now what. What is it that Psalm 100 is teaching and requiring of us? What's it teaching and requiring of us? Well, this is the majority of this of the psalm. Is in terms of, this would be the largest section, because this is a very action-packed psalm, right? So it's what are we to do? We're to shout to Yahweh, serving Yahweh with gladness, coming before Yahweh, singing joyfully, knowing that Yahweh is God, entering places of worship, giving thanks, blessing Yahweh's name. So here we have the what. What do you do? Well, there's a lot to do. And we could, again, super summarize it and say, giving thanks and worship. But someone can say, what are you saying with that? Well, we're saying, shout to Yahweh, serving Yahweh, coming before Yahweh, singing joyfully, knowing that Yahweh is good, entering places of worship, giving thanks, and blessing Yahweh's name. So a lot in that small five verse what for Psalm 100. And while we're not in a context to more fully develop these things, if it was maybe a Sunday morning, we'd walk through them more methodically and unpack them and look at what does that mean and how does that work itself out. We can have a general walk-away understanding. So with that, you can plainly see the range of expressions of worship that are all centered on Yahweh. So we see that. That's the most obvious and plain thing. Shouting, serving, coming, singing, knowing, engaging, thanking, and blessing, all centered on Yahweh. All things that are doable, right? These are things that Psalm 100 is kind of rallying us to worship. And while we'll come back to this in a moment, I want you to be thinking about, maybe even now, you can passively think while you also listen. How can we put hands and feet to those things? It's a lot of things, simple in one sense, but what do we do with it? So kind of tuck that away for a little bit. Next is the where of Psalm 100, the where. So we've gotten who, what, where. And this is much more simplistic, but we do have two things to work with here. So we have all the earth. So we have, where is this to be worked itself out? Well, in some measure, throughout the earth. And then, more precisely, the tabernacle or temple, right? So that's, again, we would expect that in terms of a worship and Thanksgiving context, and especially the Hebrew cultural and religious context, the temple or tabernacle. So all the earth and the temple or tabernacle. And that might seem like a wasted category, like, oh, move on, that was too obvious, nothing to it. But does where impact worship? Yeah. So we, first of all, in this historical context, it severely impacted worship. There was an expectation. This is where God's special presence was. And given, yes, you could express some form of worship in a variety of contexts. Israel would gather together on festivals and certain times of the year is expected to come together, even, again, with thanks offerings. And so this would be one of the elective offerings. It wasn't necessarily prescribed or necessary in all contexts, but you could go worship and give thanks to God. Free will offerings, as it were. So, yeah, where does impact worship, and maybe for us as well, we can think about that and work through that just a little bit. And another simple but extremely consequential list: the how. So, working our way through here, the how, and it's not simply the how of Psalm 100, but more specifically the how of worship. Does the how of worship matter? Yes, absolutely. And so, we could say in the historical context, very clearly prescribed, right? One of the easiest in terms of when you have a couple of moments in redemptive history that the Lord just kind of lays out, look, I said something, I really expect you to do it. So we had Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, that offered strange fire. They offered incense that was not prescribed, and what happened to them? They died for it. We had the man that broke the Sabbath. What happened to him? Early on here, he's picking up sticks, and, well, now you're going to be stoned to death. Boy, well, the law had just been established. You will regard the Lord as holy. We talked last week about failing to treat the Lord as holy when Aaron and Moses more overtly struck the rock. You failed to treat me as holy. And then we go to the New Testament. What would be a New Testament example of people dying? Ananias and Sapphira. So now, does that happen every time? No. Thankfully. I mean, boy, could you imagine? Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be high attendance Sunday. It would be like Stay Alive Sunday. Nobody do something to act the fool or to disregard the commandments of God or to lie to the Holy Spirit. So there are prescriptions, there are expectations, especially in the historic Hebrew context. But, one of the songs that I had actually thought about making reference to, and so I guess I am making reference to it now, in connection to verse 1 was Shout to the Lord, and there's a context in which I was going to talk about it. But do you know who wrote Shout to the Lord? It's well, I don't know her name either, so I can't help you out, but it's by the group Hillsong. Are you familiar with Hillsong? So they're in Australia. They've put out some, I mean, it's really unfortunate in one sense because some of their songs, that was helpful. That was nice. Nothing you're going to overtly critique it for, but they themselves have strayed severely, and maybe I don't know where they started. Maybe straying was in the roots of it, but some things that are shocking that we can associate with biblical worship. And so we tend to disassociate from choosing to draw from their things. And those are decisions we have to make. Like at what point, how much disassociation and association, how much do we want to dig up on the hymn writers? We need to use discretion, obviously. But there's clearly an expectation of worship shouldn't be silly, shouldn't be vulgar, shouldn't dishonor the Lord, right? We don't have to have as overt of prescriptions as Israel had. So we would say worship matters. And there's a way that it matters here as well. So what's the tone of this song? See if you can help me out with that. It's a very clear tone, and maybe I'm not being clear when I'm even asking that question, because I am looking for something. So maybe it's the emotion you tie with it, if that helps you out.
Rejoice.
This is a really joyful, happy, rejoicing psalm. And so initially I was thinking, does the how of worship matter? And I was going to say Psalm 51, because there you have David talking about the broken and contrite heart. I thought that matters. But I'd rather marry it with the tone it has. So again, Psalm 51 would fit with a how, but I think you can actually go to 2 Corinthians 9, 6, and 7, because we've already established that service is worship, and giving is an expression of service, an expression of worship. And how does Paul command or expect the Corinthians to give? To do so cheerfully, not begrudgingly. So it's an expression of worship, giving back to the Lord what he's generously provided and entrusting him. It's very much like rest. It's very much like a lot of things. Lord, you've given this to me. I'm going to yield it back to you, and I trust your stewardship over my own. But it's to be done cheerfully, right?
Well, it's focusing on God.
Yeah.
Whereas like in Psalm 51, sometimes it's focusing on how we failed. And that's a time of sadness and remorse. But this is all about the Lord and the goodness and what he's done for us. And it's a beautiful thing.
It's a reasonable, so maybe God's providence, the running narrative that spilled over to a Spanish version that came back to English that we started off this evening, that this is the day. Maybe God's providence, that's why you just needed a nice little boost to, this is the day that the Lord has made, and I will rejoice in it. And so here we are, the cheerful disposition. I think that's part of the how in worship. What bad advocates we are if we're worshiping as like the most miserable people, like somebody's, what are you in for? I don't know, but I got to worship. Okay, wow, that's real attractive, isn't it?
Is that passage where it says, "This is the day that the Lord has made, and will be glad and rejoicing"? Is that talking about time to do battle? Is that in the battle context?
That sounds correct, but I don't want to betray my ignorance by giving bad answers.
This is what the Lord seems to me out of it.
Yeah, that sounds correct, but I'm going to have to punt to be sure. I'm sorry. And finally, the why of Psalm 100. So we've worked through all the other elements of the why of Psalm 100, and we've talked about this with the outline. We've seen this addressed in the structure, verses 3 and 5. Give us the why. Well, Yahweh is God. Okay, that's why enough, isn't it? When we have point of contact and response to the Creator God, to the Sovereign God, to the Holy God, then worship is the most natural response. Yahweh is God. Yahweh created us. So we recognize that, yes, there was an immediate historical context in which he created a people for himself, namely Israel. In that historical context, he did create this body church, and he created man more generally as well. So Yahweh's created us. That's grounds for worship. Yahweh is our shepherd. Again, don't memorize John 10 and be like, whatever that's about. Well, that's reason to give thanks. That's encouraging. Yahweh is good. We need to be very, very grateful for that, because it's interesting, the news and the world around us, it provokes in us some things. Maybe we should be more provoked by the fact that Yahweh is good, without stain or blemish or fault. Yahweh's everlasting love, his covenant love, has his covenant love ever failed or dwindled? No. And then Yahweh's faithfulness is, again, an expression of that. He's faithful from generation to generation. This is not a matter of deficiency or indifference. So all these things evoke our worship. And with the why, we note the obvious. A psalm centered on thanksgiving and worship is going to find and it's why. It's going to find its why in Yahweh. So if it's centered on worship, and if it's centered on thanksgiving, the why is ultimately going to be the Lord, in his person, his works, and his ways. That's the ultimate why. That's why worship. Now, it was a fast run through. Maybe it wasn't as fast as it felt like, but it was a fast run through. But with that being said, I'm going to give you one more warning. I want to think about how to put this to action. It can be very, very, very simple. Think about how we can return thanks. You can think about your day. You can think about your more broadly, your redemption in Christ, your family, where you are in history, any of these things. But I want you to think about that. So I'm going to ask you about it in just a moment, because I think a good response is not just be like, yes, a psalm of thanksgiving. And then immediately, well, this thing's happening and we need to pray that the Lord would heal, restore, bring back, or otherwise. Those are good things to pray about. And we give thanks to God that we can pray for those things and that he does care for us, that the Spirit doesn't fall without his attention being directed that way. So we're mindful of that. But let's think about thanksgiving. So think about that. And as you're thinking about it, I'm going to kind of prime us, because I gave a good bit of thought and attention to verse 1. It may not look like it because it's going to be very simple, but I thought about it a good bit. And I was trying to think, what shout to the Lord? What does that look like? What is that expressing? I just was wondering. I'm trying to work through that. And I was walking through the scriptures in terms of people shouting and why they were shouting. Sometimes you hear people shouting outside. You're like, what is that about? Well, I did that with the scriptures. Like, why are they shouting? So that being said, I'm going to start off with a sports illustration analogy. And I'm going to have an image. And I know it's absolutely unnecessarily clear, but I'm going to go ahead and qualify it, because so many people conflate worship with sports, and I'm not doing that. It's a simple illustration. We're clear, right? All right. So this week, I had a big moment in professional soccer world. So there's a lot of trading, a lot of pieces moving around and stuff. Who's going where? Why are they moving? And I told you all about another soccer player a couple weeks ago. I'm not going to just draw on soccer players on the international stage very often, unless it just fits the occasion. And unlike the NFL draft that we were dabbling with the fantasy league as a point of fellowship and camaraderie, I actually know something here I don't know there. So arguably one of the greatest players maybe to ever play is Messi. And he's not like making room Messi, but Messi's his last name. And he just recently traded teams, and this was a really big deal. I don't think he's ever moved teams in his career. Could be wrong on that. There's probably somebody out there in the social media world waiting to pounce. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he did. But this was a huge move. And these guys don't just move like from one city to the other. This is like one point of loyalty to another, even nationally and whatnot. So this was a really big deal. And this scene here, this picture, was the moment he was subbed into the game. And what was interesting is there was a profound reaction to this moment. And then with him, so he's the guy with the tattoo sleeves, the kind of bending forward. That's Messi. And then there's his teammate. You know who his teammate is? Anybody? I don't know. So he's an unnamed teammate. And that's about where he stands in some of our appreciation. He's probably incredibly gifted. He wouldn't be there. But the unnamed teammate, I was reading a thing where he commented on this picture. He says, that moment, I've never received so much cheering and applause in my life. And then he's like, I was being subbed into the game that sometimes Messi. So he's like, but wow, it wasn't about me, but wow, that was quite a moment. And there's people outside the stadium and watching. They're just like, yes, because they got their guy and he's going on the field. And he will be a game changer, quite literally. So people were shouting. They were overwhelmed with joy and emotion. This was a huge moment for them. And I think there's something to be learned from this. And I don't mean that, a lot of times when people make sports illustrations, people, how you respond at games, they're like, oh, you respond like that at games? Why don't you act like that at church? I'm grateful you don't. That would be really, really awkward. If we were, I'm not a big fan of ecstatic and overwhelming behavior, and I think it'd be quite peculiar to have that in our worship context. I think it would actually detract. I've been around worship context where I remember one was a long time ago, and none of y'all have any point of connection with this context, so it's safe to even be generally making reference to it. But a person was actually told, you need to calm down. And they weren't being weird, just a bit much, to the point where it detracted from corporate worship. Now, if they sway arms up and like broad, church only got so much space, and it's not to be like, well, you're dampening the spirit. It's like, well, no, you're with other people, and so there's a reciprocating nature to this. And so I know I'm not going to say, why won't you worship like Messi entering a game? I wouldn't expect that. That'd be weird. But as I walked through many passages on the term for shouting, I found what you might naturally expect. You have enthusiastic expression of joy, or the unifying cry of battle. People going into battle, just yelling and getting all worked up and excited. David slays Goliath, and we don't have the Children's Bible version, so the stone goes in the forehead, chops the head off, and the Philistines, they didn't honor their promise to forfeit. No, they're gone. Israel yells and gives chase to them. And as a fitting response, battle and overwhelmed with joy. And I would argue what's happening with shouting in these kind of contexts, from the soccer world and their silly fleeting games to the battles, to people in worship, well, it's summoning up an overwhelming experience that erupts out of someone. And I'm not again advocating ecstatic worship in corporate services, like, or just I can't help it, it's overwhelmed inside of me. But I do think there's a place for welling up from within that comes out strongly, that we don't sing like, maybe that's the best you got. But someone that's singing more robustly probably really believes this is the day that the Lord has given me. And I'm going to rejoice. And you see the difference in something welling up versus.
Well, it shows confidence in God.
Yeah, and
He is faithful. He keeps his promises, and we can trust him.
Yeah, and there's a gratitude for it, a real gratitude. So I think that's a proper response. So when we see shout to the Lord, and the illustration that I initially killed because I was like, time and Hillsong, we've already crossed those bridges. We'll burn them on the way out. But I think about when I was in Bible college, and Denise had come to visit before she came for the time that she was there also. And I was in the balcony of the chapel, and I remember watching. I said, watch this. They were singing Shout to the Lord, and there's a tone change in the song. And I said, watch and hear. And all of a sudden, everybody goes, whoop. It's like arms go up, and it was like, well, now they're really into this. And I criticized that for a long time, but now I'm like, well, I don't know. It's not what I do, but at the same time, there is an enthusiasm. Lord, we are returning thanks to you. We are grateful. So we got to figure out, where do we fit in that? I don't know, but I think it's something to wrestle with and struggle with in terms of, is something welling up within me that I want to give enthusiastic, at least strong worship back to God. And again, something to wrestle with. Please don't shout in the service. Please don't tell Frank and Matt, well, Wednesday, David said I need to cut loose. I also told you there's people sitting next to you. So, and we got to work through it, because again, I tend to err on the, well, let's be uber cautious and conservative, and that's a happy place for me. But at the same time, let joy inform tone and inflection, and that we're really worshiping. We're not just singing, because there's two things that are happening with corporate worship. We're singing to the Lord, and we're singing for the benefit of one another. It's not like, what do they hear this? But there's an affirming, and we're joining together doing it. That's why when you go to conferences, so I'll be part of a conference this fall, and there'll be thousands of people, and people get excited when that means people sing together. It's not because, there's a lot of them. It's because you're feeding, and not some ecstatic sense, but like affirming, and you're hearing thousands of other people affirming and joining. So if nothing else, we can shout to the Lord. We can wrestle through, what does that look like? Well, again, we got to wrestle. So what about the other elements? I bought you as much time as I could. So how do we put hands and feet to it? Skipped back to the missions moment. I didn't know. There we go. How do we put hands and feet to it? Just ideas and suggestions. And it doesn't have to be anything, like come up with something brilliantly profound. Just for what do you give thanks to God for? To what can we give thanks to God for? Just at least a couple.
Everything?
Yeah, everything. So there you go. and including everything would be waking up. So why do we give thanks to God for waking up?
Because he didn't have to
Yeah,
allow us to.
yeah. You are the most in your most deceased-like state when you're asleep. Your body's shut down. But the Lord is restoring your body, giving it strength, preparing it for the next day, and then He lets it wake up. That's a kindness. Not everybody does wake up, and the Lord's gracious.
It makes me think of how so many people serve the Lord because nobody else will, or they're filling a spot, or someone thinks they have a skill that would be useful, and inside they can't get out of it, and that is so displeasing.
Yes, and we don't want to drift toward compulsory service. One of the I was very, very grateful for my time at the sheriff's office, and they appreciated me. They made that very, very clear. They were very kind in that regard, but they'd also make it clear to all of us, there's not one of you that are indispensable. It's we like you, we're grateful for you, but I think that's a good check in terms of even the church. This is Christ Church. Would it impact things if somebody was serving by compulsion and they stopped? Maybe. But it's Christ Church. He'll take care of his church. He's gifted it.
If we don't have gladness,
Yes,
what are we
yeah.
really doing?
Yeah, and then again, and that goes back to even cheerful giving when we're looking at 2 Corinthians, that it's the Lord's resources, and if you don't want to give them cheerfully, then just hold on to them and see how well that goes, and that's fine. But this is worship, so yeah, you're right. We want to do not to be out of compulsion, but to have a disposition of joy and thanksgiving. And there are times where it's like most things in life. There may be seasons where not excited about doing this, but I'm going to do it, and there's an intentionality. I'm going to choose to be faithful. And I know joy will soon to catch up. And sometimes it's part of relationships for sure. Good. Yes.
So I'm always thankful for the sunrise, because even though the world always feels like it's going chaotic, the sun comes up every single day.
Yeah.
And I know that God is still holding the world in balance, even though it doesn't feel that way. And it's just an assurance. That same sun, it rose over Abraham when he promised Abraham, or even the moon, right? Like just when I see those things, it just reminds me to be thankful.
Yeah, that's I think that's a really good point in terms of it's from the first week of creation to the present. The sun has, and again, I'm sure there's somebody waiting to be like, well, it doesn't really rise.
Well,
we're choosing the language of vantage point that is used in the scriptures. And it's, the fact that same sun has risen throughout all of redemptive history, and the consistency.
Like we can time it. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So.
Yeah, the Lord's, and if He's faithful and able to handle the balance of creation, He can probably handle us. Again, we especially we get in the moments of crisis, and it's hard not to be short-sighted and crisis and struggle. But if He can handle this, probably going to be okay.
Being a mom and a grandma, there have been a few times in my life when a family member's seen my car pull in the driveway, and all of a sudden the front door would burst open and out would run a child saying, "Oh, thank goodness you're here," because there's a big emergency going on and whatnot. And that's what I think of when I put those two together. When we allow it to dawn on us, like the rising of the sun, that God is here. I mean, it's like acknowledge His presence. Be in awe. Go ahead, let it overwhelm you. Don't let it be a common everyday. We should really be kind of walking around thinking, this is real. God He's here. You're here. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're in this with me. I am not alone.
Yeah, and so again, it may be in God's kind providence, the simplicity of the song that I accidentally picked, that as simple as it is, that this is the day the Lord has made. We could sing that every day. There's not a day we couldn't sing that it wouldn't fit. But also to point, if anybody's interested, Rich Mullins has a song, "Everywhere I Go I See You," and it's kind of drawing from that. Like, there's not a point of creation in which we can't enjoy the magnificence of our Creator. Kevin.
Being able to give thanks to music.
Yeah, and music is a huge thing in the scriptures too. So with music, for music, I struggled undervaluing music for a long time, but then you have King David, who was arguably the preeminent worshiper in Israel. And what does he do? He sets up a system that remained for singers and musicians for temple worship. And he expected this, and how highly does he prioritize it? Where you feed them and you pay for them. And it wasn't like, oh, we'll get a volunteer band together. This is part of worship. And then the book of Nehemiah, where the city walls are being rebuilt, they come together, they're giving thanks to God, they're praying, and then they're singing, and they have musicians. It was important. So yeah, that's a big part of both expressing worship and returning thanks to God, even for the beauty of music and its order. So we're not all Mr. Antons, but the same order of math works for music. And it's the consistency of it, and it's, I guess, math poetry, however that works.
It's ordering. Worship out.
Anything else? If not, we'll transition to formal time of prayer. All right, we're going to, just by way of reminder, we're praying for the Christ Church throughout the world, but we're going to go ahead and say goodbye to our friends that are with us remotely. You can say goodbye.
Bye. The letter sounds.
No one's ever told me that.